You might think pirates spent most of their time swinging from rigging, shouting "Arr!" and hunting for buried treasure, but their biggest enemy wasn't the Royal Navy or rival buccaneers. It was something much, much simpler. Running out of food. Not just for a few days, mind you, but for 6 whole months. Yeah, 6 months of staring at empty barrels, rubbing sand into scraggly beards, and wondering if ship's rats could become signature dishes. Let me tell you something wild about what happened when pirates ran out of grub. It wasn't always sword fights and swagger. It was desperate, ridiculous, sometimes grotesque, and surprisingly clever. And trust me, the solutions they came up with were about as appetizing as a cannonball in your stew. But somehow they worked, or the crews would have mutinied faster than you could say scurvy. So picture this. You're aboard the infamous Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's floating nightmare, in the early 1700s. You've got a crew of roughly 100 hungry souls, each needing about 2 pounds of food and 1.5 gallons of fresh water every single day. That's about 200 pounds of food and 150 gallons of water daily. Seems doable, right? Except your ship's stores were packed with salted meat, hardtack biscuits, and if you were lucky, dried peas and beans. But those supplies ran dry halfway through a particularly long voyage across the Caribbean. The problem? Ships back then could barely carry enough fresh water for more than a month, and after that, the barrels turned into a floating petri dish of slimy blue algae and something pirates called the stink. You can probably guess how that ended. Crews getting sick, fights breaking out, morale hitting rock bottom. Bad idea, really bad idea. The first desperate measure, drinking beer and rum instead of water. Yep, pirates preferred their grog with plenty of alcohol, figuring the booze killed off the nastier germs. Here's the twist, it kinda worked. Not as a health tonic, but the alcohol content in grog, usually watered-down rum, was enough to knock down some bacteria. Pirates end up drinking 10 to 15 gallons of this stuff per day per crew member. Not exactly a balanced diet, unless liquid bread counts as nutrition. Of course, it didn't stop half the crew from getting dehydration headaches or worse, but it bought them some time. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by sipping more booze than eating food. But hey, desperate times call for desperate swigs. Then it got worse. When the last barrel was tapped and the grog turned to vinegar, the pirates tried to get inventive. They'd collect rainwater in damaged sails or broken barrels, but talk about your version of a water treatment plant. One captain, Edward Lowe, supposedly ordered his men to collect seawater that evaporated overnight, condense it, and scrape the salt off the sailcloth like a bizarre form of homemade desalination. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The water was briny and disgusting, and more than a few pirates reported stomach cramps so bad they wished for cannon fire instead. Still, they were willing to try anything to avoid the stiff-legged walk of scurvy. Now scurvy, pirates' worst nightmare, was the slow poison that no amount of grog could cure. This disease, caused by vitamin C deficiency, would let crew members' gums rot away, teeth fall out, and limbs swell up like water balloons. The crew looked less like gallant seamen and more like zombie extras in a pirate-themed horror flick. So with fresh fruits nowhere to be found, pirates started experimenting with risky food sources. One famous tactic was eating the ship's rats. Yes, the rodents running around hiding under floorboards, nibbling on crumbs, suddenly became prime protein. But here's the catch. Rats aren't exactly known for their sparkling health, especially when they have been surviving off ship hull grime and who knows what else. This led to plenty of stomach-turning results. Some pirates developed dysentery, some got plagues of fleas, and others simply refused, which in pirate parlance could land you in the brig or worse. There's an account from 1717 of a stranded crew tossing a rat roasted over an open flame, only to discover halfway through that the critter was actually carrying one of the worst flavors they ever tasted. The smell was so noxious that some men vowed they'd sooner eat their own boots, which, spoiler alert again, they soon tried. Speaking of boots and clothing, when food sources became ultra-limited, pirates started looking at unconventional options and obviously learned to separate the edible from the inedible. One weird but surprisingly effective tactic was harvesting seaweed and various ocean plants. It sounds like a fishy salad bar, and honestly it was. But seaweed's vitamin content helped stave off scurvy and kept the crew's guts moving. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the Golden Age, was noted for ordering his men to collect seaweed off the ship's hull after storms. Not exactly Michelin star fare, but it had a 70% success rate at keeping some measurable nutrition in the crew's bellies. Of course, not every attempt was half-decent. One particularly grim episode involved a group of marooned pirates who tried boiling barnacles scraped off the ship's bow. Barnacles, for the uninitiated, are those crusty little suckers your fishing boat drags every summer. They're basically tiny underwater armor plated with calcium. The pirates hoped that boiling them for hours would extract some edible substance. Let's just say it wasn't pretty. The resulting sludge was both gritty and slimy, a combo that earned the nickname pirate paste. Anecdotes tell of men slipping into delirium after eating it, hallucinating about their old lives and regretting every questionable decision that led to that moment. Another disaster involved turning to insects. Yes, bugs. When sea rats and barnacles didn't cut it, some crews reportedly went after swarms of locusts or flies trapped on deck, especially during tropical storms. One scrappy crew off the coast of Jamaica in 1723 tried frying them up in grease leftover from ship cooking. The problem: not only were the insects tough and flavorless, but the frying pan was often so blackened with soot that the bugs ended up tasting like burnt charcoal. Bad idea all around. This became a running joke among rival pirate crews, with captains boasting, "Our bugs taste like burnt treasure, yours smell like seaweed stew." But pirates weren't just bumbling their way through hunger. They had no choice but to innovate. One particularly clever solution was preserving fish catches by drying and smoking them on board. Catching fish was risky during storms because sailors risked getting knocked overboard, but the payoff was huge. Once dried and smoked, fish could be stored for months. This method wasn't perfect because of the salty smoke taste and occasional infestation with wriggling larvae, but it was definitely better than gnawing on rat tails. Historical logs from Captain Henry Morgan's ship in 1699 report that his crew once ate nothing but smoked fish for 45 days straight during a blockade. "You think you love barbecue," Morgan reportedly joked. "Try it with a side of salt and fly eggs." Beyond fish, pirates discovered that cooking methods made a huge difference. They were masters at turning whatever was available into something vaguely edible. For example, boiling hardtack repeatedly to soften it until it resembled more of a mush than a biscuit. Because nothing says pirate breakfast like soggy cardboard, and often adding whatever seaweed or dried fish bits they could scrape up. This was a far cry from gourmet meals, but superior to starving. Plus, it gave pirates a chance to vent their frustrations by poking at their food for hours, which was apparently a morale booster. Can't say it improved taste though. Napoleon Bonaparte once claimed his army suffered something similar munching on freeze-dried potatoes, but pirates had centuries of nasty seas fare ahead of them. To keep spirits up amidst the gloom were salt pork punchlines, essentially salty pork fat that could be rationed and stretched out with whatever bitter herbs were found on island stops. Some accounts reveal that the officers kept their better rations for themselves, leaving common sailors the most disgusting scraps, and yet the crews somehow kept functioning. It's pretty impressive for a combination of salt, fat, and occasional gut rot to keep a ship afloat. You might wonder how pirates even managed to ration food without turning the deck into a battlefield. After all, when 60 men fight over the last piece of dried meat, things get ugly fast. Enter the pirate code. Yes, pirates actually had rules, one of which included strict food rationing. Each man got a daily mess, often half a pound of hardtack and a quarter pound of salted meat. Refusing to share or stealing meant walking the plank or dangle from the yardarm for a bit. Basically pirate justice for gluttony. One documented case from the crew of the Whydah in 1716 described a mutiny triggered by a cook hoarding half a barrel of beans. The guy ended up with a wooden leg and a bad reputation that lasted longer than his treasure map. Even with food rationing, starvation was a slow companion. Pirates often observed that men weakened by hunger also fell victim to other shipboard hazards faster, like infections and violence. So the pressure to find food escalated to bizarre levels. Some pirates tried chasing down turtles, thinking their meat and eggs would solve the problem. The trouble: turtles were slow but vicious when cornered, and catching one involved more injuries, including broken bones, than actual meat. The process involved hacking through thick shells and then trying to quickly cook the meat before it spoiled in tropical heat. One sailor reportedly lost his fingers attempting to pry turtle eggs out. Guess what? The eggs tasted bitter and were quickly discarded overboard. Despite all this, pirates had an uncanny ability to bounce back. The combination of stealing fresh food from captured ships, eating whatever was available on islands, and their bizarre mix of preservation techniques meant they often survived long enough to reach help. Or, get caught and hanged. But the 6-month starve fests, those were a nightmare that no map, no treasure, and no rum could solve. So next time you think pirates lived only for adventure and grog, remember the disgusting, desperate smorgasbord of survival they endured when the food barrels hit empty. Because nothing says fearsome marauder of the seas like gnawing on a ship's rat while praying for rain. Now, let's dive deeper into what happened when pirates faced that dreaded 6-month food drought, and things got even stranger on the high seas. You see, when you run out of salted pork and hardtack biscuits, which, by the way, tasted like someone slapped a stale brick between your teeth, you have to get creative. I mean, desperate enough to eat your clothes. Check. Desperate enough to chase down turtles the size of your fist. Double check. But here's the kicker. Pirates eventually stumbled onto survival hacks that, while not gourmet, kept them breathing and occasionally grumbling less. First up, let's talk preservation, because while salted meat was supposed to last forever, the reality was a bit messier. Pirates stored 60-gallon barrels of salted beef or pork, but over 6 months the salt content, usually around 3.5%, would leach out. Moisture would creep in, and you'd be left with meat that looked less like a meal and more like a science experiment growing cultures no one signed up for. Spoiler alert. Eating spoiled salted meat meant vomiting, diarrhea, and a one-way ticket to the brig or worse, shark bait. Bad idea. Really bad idea. So what did pirates do? They turned to smoking and drying fish they caught on the voyage. Think of it as the 17th century version of beef jerky. Except the pirate version tasted like a campfire that forgot to quit smoking for a week. The real genius was drying fish on rigging ropes under the sun and smoking it over slow-burning fires made from driftwood. This method reduced moisture content dramatically and killed bacteria that would cause spoilage. Pirate logs from Henry Morgan's fleet in 1699 mention that his crew survived for a record 45 days eating mostly smoked mackerel. Sure, the fish sometimes came with wriggling larvae, but hey, protein is protein, and those larvae packed a surplus of vitamin C, accidental nutrition. Turns out that was 70% effective in keeping scurvy at bay for stretches. Not bad for a bunch of sea dogs. Of course, all this pale in comparison to the ingenuity pirates showed with sea vegetables. We touched on it earlier. Seaweed was basically their ocean salad. But pirates discovered that certain varieties like bladderwrack and kelp were surprisingly rich in vitamin C and iodine. Captain Bartholomew Roberts actually issued orders, specifically mandating the collection of seaweed after bad storms when the ocean threw up fresh stuff onto the decks. It's basically free food right there, but sailing won't win you Michelin stars. Vomiting, some did, but others actually found the flavor to be a salty, slightly briny punch that could distract your taste buds from the fact they hadn't seen fresh fruit in half a year. That's about as close to a pirate superfood as you're gonna get. 70% effective, again, which meant scurvy was delayed enough for them to make landfall or capture a loot-laden merchant ship. Now here's where it gets downright disgusting, and our pirate story gets a little more hardcore. Throughout the 6-month stretch, many crews resorted to eating their fellow passengers' leftovers or outright trash. More than a few sailors got creative with turning old, crusty hardtack biscuits into something resembling mush. They soaked these rock-hard biscuits in whatever liquid they had left, usually grog or seawater, and boiled them for hours. The result? A gelatinous, slightly acidic paste that was somehow less horrible than eating it dry, but just barely. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by slurping what was basically soggy cardboard porridge. Some pirates even used desperate tactics like eating boiled leather, usually scraps of boots or belts. The leather had been tanned and treated with oils, which softened with long boiling, turning into a slimy, chewy mess. This gambit wasn't nutritional gold, more like desperate filler, and reportedly led to blistered mouths or worsened scurvy symptoms. But hungry pirates ate whatever was available, because nothing says pirate bravery like gnashing your teeth on what used to hold stiletto swords. And rats. We mentioned them, but let's get real. Rats became the unofficial mascot when all else failed. Imagine 50 men trying to hunt wily, disease-ridden rodents in the dark, cramped below decks. The rats were as nasty as you'd expect, filthy from gnawing on ships' bilge water and uncollected scraps, crawling with fleas and God knows what else. Some pirates boiled them to kill parasites and made rat stew, which mostly tasted like desperation and regret. Some crews reported that the smell alone was enough to cause mutiny threats. The 1717 Journal of One Sea Dog off the Virgin Islands recounts a night where the entire crew refused to eat rat meat, forcing their captain to threaten the use of the cat as a replacement meal. Spoiler alert, no one wanted to eat the cat either. Let's take a second to appreciate the irony here. These pirates, hailed as ruthless marauders, often had to be persuaded, sometimes beaten, to eat enough to keep going. The code of conduct aboard ship didn't just apply to dividing treasure, it applied harshly to rations. A man caught stealing extra food risked severe punishment, so desperate crews often still starved in silence rather than provoke wrath. One infamous case on the Whydah in 1716 involved a cook hoarding half a barrel of dried beans. When discovered, the cook was reportedly tarred and feathered and sent ashore with a wooden leg, missing more than his dignity. Morale was everything, and hunger was the quickest way to crack a crew apart. But what about water? Beyond the grog and failed rain catchers, pirates developed an eyebrow-raising solution that actually worked better than you'd expect. They carefully rationed seawater vapor condensation. Pirates didn't know about modern distillation, but they replicated a crude version by leveraging temperature differences overnight. One captain's men stretched sailcloth below deck, where it would cool more quickly than the humid air above. Moisture condensed on the cloth and ran into barrels, which the crew eagerly lapped up. It was a pitiful substitute for fresh water, but it had three key benefits. The salt content was drastically reduced, foul algae wasn't present, and it was free. The catch? This yield was minuscule, maybe 2 gallons a night for a 50-man crew, still far from ideal but vital for survival. Think of it as their version of a water treatment plant, only without the EPA certification. Pirates called it moon water, attributing the moisture magically to the phases of the moon, which made night watches particularly magical, or so they insisted. Meanwhile, in between all this starving and scrounging, pirates would do their best to hunt turtles and seabirds on secluded islands. Capturing a turtle, for example, wasn't the easiest gig. These slow movers had shells 5 inches thick and teeth sharp enough to gnaw through rope. Pirates had to hack at the shell with their cutlasses or club the turtle into submission. Good luck handling that with scurvy-fueled weak hands. Then came the tasting. Turtle meat sometimes tasted bitter or fishy if not cooked immediately, and their eggs were reportedly chalky and somewhat astringent. But when fresh water and food supplies were zeroed out, it was a decadence to be savored. When turtles and seabirds weren't an option, some crews turned to insects, specifically locust swarms that occasionally swept the Caribbean islands. You might be thinking, really? Bugs? Yep, beyond the usual rodents and barnacles, reports exist of pirates frying locusts in leftover grease. This crude protein source, while high in nutrients and easy to gather, usually tasted like burnt charcoal because the frying pans doubled as soot catchers for the ship's stove fire. At best, this was more of a crunchy snack than real food. One pirate captain joked, "Our bugs taste like burnt treasure, yours smell like seaweed stew," and this became a running gag among rival crews. So imagine the insults flying over gastronomical disasters instead of cannons. You'd think this would be the bottom of the barrel, literally, the end of the culinary road on the high seas. But pirates had one last trick: alcohol preservation. Now, we've talked about grog as a water substitute, but pirates found that soaking food in rum or brandy could actually preserve it longer. The alcohol, at 5 to 7% concentration, acted as an antimicrobial agent. It was basically a 17th century food sanitizer, and they might have been the first accidental frontier food scientists. Salted meat soaked in rum lasted at least 10 days longer without obvious spoilage. Not exactly a balanced diet. considering the toxic joyride of 15 gallons of grog down per day per man. But when you're stuck between scurvy and starvation, that extra week of edible rations was a game-changer. And here's a juicy tidbit. Some pirate captains became infamous for their personal bourbon stocks. Captain Charles Vane famously carried barrels of brandy designated not for drinking, but for soaking meat, so his men could eat for longer and keep fighting. He managed to keep his crew alive through blockades solely on salted meat and booze-soaked hardtack mush. Now that's leadership, if questionable. In the end, after 6 months of ridiculous diets, sea rats, soggy biscuit mush, burnt bugs, and questionable moon water, pirates emerged surprisingly intact. Sure, some men were sickly, some lost teeth, and others lost their minds hallucinating from scurvy or desperate hunger. But the nightmare of starvation taught them lessons that went down in pirate lore and even trickled into naval survival manuals. The rules of rationing, the weird discoveries of edible seaweed, the dodgy desalination attempts. All these were survival tactics that laid groundwork for modern maritime food storage and water treatment. So next time you picture pirates solely as rum-guzzling swashbucklers hunting gold, remember the real battle was against hunger itself. And they fought it with a bizarre menu that included pirate paste, rat stew, burnt locust snacks, and soggy leather boots. Eating your ship's rats while holding a lantern under a sailcloth for condensation might not be the romantic image most people expect. But hey, it was survival, pirate style. And sometimes, after 6 months of this culinary chaos, the real treasure wasn't gold or jewels, but the very taste of fresh fruit and clean water they dreamed about as they stared at empty barrels and tried to ignore the grog-induced headaches. Because in the end, nothing says fearsome marauder of the seas quite like gnawing your way through despair while waiting for rain to turn to moonwater. Now that's a pirate's life.